back to our podcast, Cash, Color, and Control. We are Colorado Fiscal Institute. We are a economic and tax policy nonprofit, and we push for policies that advance social and racial justice. So we're here today talking about the connection between tax policy and racial justice. You're joining us here for episode 3. And I'm joined by our Deputy Director, Esther Tercios, and a friend of CFI, Brakeyshia Samms. Esther, do you want to introduce Brakeyshia for us?
Yeah, well, welcome back, everyone. We are so excited for episode 3. We have a friend here with us today, Brakeyshia Samms, who's the senior analyst at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, or ITEP. ITEP is a longtime partner of CFI at the national level. And Brakeyshia is not only an amazing senior analyst, but also a friend. She, for over a decade, she has produced engaging research and analysis for many of today's tax policy debates. As a senior analyst on the cross-cutting research team at ITEP, she writes and presents on local, state, and federal tax policies, and especially focuses on how these policies relate to racial equity. And her key role really is to inform the public and support advocates like CFI and folks across the country and policymakers with analyses that really help to advance equitable tax policies and policy solutions that help to remedy some of the historical injustices we've been talking about. So I'm personally really excited because Brakeyshia is also a friend. We are both alum of the Center on Budget's State Party Partnership Fellowship Program. So, Brakeyshia, we are so excited to have you here when we were thinking about the podcast and outlining these episodes. We thought, who better than you to come join us to talk about the impacts of tax policy decisions federally at the state level. So, thanks so much for being here today.
I'm excited to be here today and chat with you all.
In episode 1, as you all will remember, we talked about why tax justice is social justice and how CFI has come to believe this and come to act upon this. In episode 2, we talked about how tax policies that we still use today are rooted in racist intentions and racist policy. So today we are talking about more recent tax history. Where we left you in episode 2 was somewhere around the 1930s, 1940s. So today we'll be jumping ahead a little bit, talking about the 1980s a little bit, the Reagan era, and then some of the fight that's being had today. So we are going to talk through some of the pivotal moments in our country's history that have really shaped outcomes for people of color and low-income people. And a lot of those are happening both at the state level, but also at the federal level. So we want to talk a little bit about federal policy today. So examples that we shared in episode 2, they were both explicitly racist and explicitly intended to keep money and power in the hands of wealthy white men. When we jump forward into the 1980s and into today, as racial and social justice movements progress, we see less explicitly racist language in tax policy. We see tax policy that's being sold as more race neutral, even though we know that the outcomes are still explicitly racist. So what's on the surface is not always true to the impact that is actually happening. One of the shifts that is resulting in those unequal outcomes is from the 1980s and into today, we see a move from taxing wealth to actually taxing income. So Esther and Brakeyshia, what would you say is the impact of this shift in focus?
I think it compounds the economic disadvantages that we've been having in society on people of color. And so when you think about taxing wealth, that's basically capital gains. So you think about dividends, stocks, artwork, things like that. And taxing income is your wage income. That's like your W-2, what you get when you go to work and things like that. And so shifting from wealth to income really disadvantages people of color, because when you look at the income of white households, they typically depend more on wealth, and this income is getting taxed less than income from work, where you see more people of color because of society where they're working lower wage jobs because of economic discrimination, job discrimination, segregation, things like that. you see they're working at a job where they have a W-2 or wages, they're getting taxed at a higher rate. And so you see this disadvantage. So on paper, you're thinking, okay, you see wealth and income being taxed differently. That's, now that's a race neutral policy that it doesn't explicitly say Black people are being taxed one rate, white people are being taxed one rate. But when you actually dig deep into the data, it shows this discrepancy. And so I think it's important to keep in mind that you have to look beyond the text of the actual policy and think about the actual data and what it says and what it really means for society, because as you know, for generations, people of color have been held back in this economy.
We did a jump, as you said, Talia, um, from we focus on episodes 1 on 2 on more the historical pieces, particularly the timeline of post-Reconstruction era, how important it was to zero in on the really racist policies during those times that took hold, because we see the explicit use of tax policy as a way to see the very same parallels that we're seeing now of shielding uh, wealth from being taxed. We saw that through the lowering of property taxes and the creation of the today's modern day sales tax, with which again is hits your income and not your wealth, right? Um, and then for those very same parallels, that was a really important time in history for us to focus on. And we're jumping into the 80s because, as Brakeyshia was saying, this is another really pivotal moment to focus on. The 80s was a huge turning point in history, because we see the move, as Brakeyshia uh, was talking about, this explicit intention on using tax policy as a way to move from, again, taxing wealth to taxing income. And the Reagan era, the Trump era, and most recently, just last summer, with HR 1, House Resolution 1, that passed at the federal level, these moves to really decimate the ways that we can tax wealth. And really, it's at the cost of increasing taxes, and cutting the very programs and services that support um, people who earn income through mostly W-2 and their wages. And so it's a really important time in history to focus on, that really we're seeing it play out as we speak.
And another thing to think about too with taxing wealth and taxing income is that when they were thinking about income taxes and they were cutting it, they weren't cutting it for people at the bottom, they were cutting it for people at the top. And who is at the top of the income ladder? It's not people of color. So when you think about who they're actually helping in the tax code, it's not people of color. And so when you think about the long-term implications for this is how you extend the racial wealth gap and make it wider. And so there's some research that was done by a Princeton professor showing how since Reconstruction, for a couple of decades in the early 1900s, the racial wealth gap was very wide. And then around I believe the 1940s or 50s, it was kind of going down, shrinking a little bit. But then around the 70s and 80s, it widened. And a lot of that had to do with, tax policy, business policy, corporations getting wealthier, wealth inequality, and tax policy contributes to that. And so when you think about this, it's important to keep in mind how important it is to again dig into the data, think beyond just how the policy is written and how you think about what this policy is just saying on the surface. And so you have to think about the politicians' motives and things like that.
I think you both have spoke to it a little bit. So as we have already mentioned, the Reagan era is seen as a huge turning point. And he's really known for two major tax packages, is how we'll look at them. So in 1981, we have the Economic Recovery Tax Act, and in 1986, the Tax Reform Act. How do these reshape the federal tax system? And again, you kind of mentioned some of the specific policies, but what are those specific changes that we're still kind of feeling the impact of today?
Some of the changes included, so similar to what I said earlier about how it was cutting the top tax rate. So the top tax rate was about 70%. And in the 1981 bill, it dropped it down to 50% for the top marginal tax bracket. But it did cut the tax rate for people at the lower end, but it only cut it by 3 percentage points. So who did that help the most? The people at the top. And then it also reduced the capital gains. So there you go. It reduced the capital gains rate to 20%. So income from work was being taxed at 50%, and income from wealth was being taxed at 20%. So again, you see that mismatch between what's being taxed. And then it also taxed corporate taxes. And so corporate taxes have been shown to help wealthy white shareholders. So when you see tax cuts to corporate taxes, people of color are not benefiting because they're not shareholders. And they're not shareholders because they don't have access to capital or access to small business loans. They work in low wage jobs, things like that. And so you see this kind of, push forward into society where this lopsided tax code, upside down tax code is being entrenched back into society that we've seen from the early Reconstruction days, as Esther pointed out earlier. And so in 1986, there was kind of some redemptive, kind of passionate kind of ideas. And so they made the capital gains rate and the income rate the same rate, which I guess is a good, it's, well, not guess, but it is a good idea, but it still wasn't enough. They reduced the top rate to 28%, so both capital gains and income was taxed at 28%, which is not enough to fund the important services that we all need for, education, healthcare, nutrition assistance, child care services, things like that are really important. But it also cut the corporate rate from 46% to 34%. So again, who is it helping? Who is this benefiting? We have to think about the tax code holistically. You have to think about how, on the one side, it is a tax code and who's paying the taxes, but on the other side, it's a revenue raiser that helps invest in public services. And these public services help us reduce the racial wealth gap and help us invest in programs that help people of color get ahead in a society that has disadvantaged them since day one. So I think it's important to keep that in mind with the beginning of the 1980s when you see these Reagan era tax cuts.
I want to remind folks, like, the top marginal tax rate in this country has been as high as 90%. They called it the victory tax. Reagan era tax cuts cut it down to 50%. Today, 2025, it's 37%. So it's not like we're talking about something ethereal, something that never was. The top marginal tax rate in this country was used to be 90%. We've continued slowly but surely to lower that. And again, as Brakeyshia was saying, who benefits from when you cut taxes at the top end? And then the moves, we know, as we talked about in Colorado with Tabor, the parallels at the state level of how much we've cut our state level income tax as well, to the now, I believe, 4.4%. Many folks don't know that in the 80s, actually during this very time, Colorado actually had a progressive income tax rate. So the state has known a world where you didn't have a flat tax rate, a world where, the wealthiest 1% in Colorado weren't paying the same 4.4% as folks who are being denied, SNAP assistance, and whose, Medicaid is in jeopardy. And so I think it's really important to keep in mind that for every tax cut, particularly those that benefit the wealthiest people, you have to pay for it somewhere. There's always someone paying. And in these cases, as we'll see, from the 80s on, is that it has come at the cost of all the programs and services that actually help create healthy and thriving communities.
Exactly. I like the way you paint that picture, and I like it because I want people to understand that it's possible to have a really good, functioning, well-funded society, and it's really important that we understand that we can have a racially just tax code that is possible. That we, like you said, we've been there before where we had a 90%, 70% income tax bracket. We've been there before where we had a capital gains tax that matched a tax on wages. So it's not like these are fairy tales that we're making up as we talk about it on this podcast. So I want to keep in mind that we just have to continue fighting and continue making our voices heard and make sure that we propose these solutions because they really will make a difference in the lives of people of color, but it also makes a difference in the lives of low income people. And then ultimately, when we think about it, it actually helps everyone because it moves the economy. It helps all communities. It helps society overall. It helps just improve everyone's lives when we think about having a fair and just tax code. And I think that's important to keep in mind because I think sometimes people think when I'm talking about racial justice and I'm only focusing on Black people or Hispanic people, I'm actually talking about everyone. And I'm talking about society as a whole because we want justice and fairness in the tax code to make sure that it can raise revenue and to make sure that it's not intentionally or even sometimes even unintentionally harming communities of color to where it's making the tax code less effective. That's why this podcast series is so important to talk about these issues and to go out and make sure that we understand that we've done this before, that we can do it again.
Yeah, that what a hopeful note to strike.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Seeing as what we're about to talk about is a moment where we need that hope desperately. Um,
Yeah.
and so, as we kind of mentioned, these huge tax breaks for people with a lot of wealth, corporations with making a lot of money, they come at a cost, and that cost is often cuts to public programs and things that we all use and need. And that same story is true in recent history, as in the past 10 years, and it's also true today. So jumping ahead a little bit, obviously there's been lots of policy made between Reagan and Trump, but if we're looking at kind of pivotal points in history, these are 2 points that emerge. And so, with Donald Trump in his first term in 2017, we see the Tax Cuts and Job Act, another kind of tax package that was part of his legacy of his first term. So that entails a lot of the same types of policies. And what do we know now already about its longer term impact?
Yeah, the TCJA, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is short, we call it TCJA, its first year it was a costly bill, but in its first year it cost around 275 billion. And our research showed that about 80% of that 275 billion went to white households. So it was an upside down, unfair tax bill that predominantly benefited white households. So you see people of color, communities of color being left behind in a tax cut that was billed as something to help progress America and it was going to help everybody. It was going to boost the economy. The economy was going to grow. And research has shown that didn't do that. It didn't do that at all. And so it further just, stymied the economy. It further progressed racial discrimination in the tax code. It further, widened the racial wealth gap. And then, for example, there was a policy in there that sounded really promising. So there were all these, ideas in there that sounded really good on paper, but again, it wasn't really good. So you have the child tax credit, right? So they increased it to $2,000. Everybody's hyped. Everybody's excited. Oh my gosh, they increased it to $2,000. But in reality, it didn't really help people of color or children of color because of the income phase-in. And so we estimated about 45% of Black children and 42% of Hispanic children didn't even receive the full credit that could have really benefited their parents with helping for childcare, with helping for raising them, groceries, rent, other bills that help to raise children and things like that. And so the long-term impact of a bill like this means that families can't take care of their kids, that society's not helping them succeed, things like that. And it hurts communities, economies, and things like that. And so I think you see where bills that are supposedly supposed to be race neutral and help the economy grow are not really working because of the way it's designed. if it's
Mhm.
designed better to help people at the bottom of the income ladder, where we see disproportionately people of color, again, because of historic discrimination and our history, just our flat out American history of slavery, of discrimination towards immigrants, of underfunding of public services, of cuts to education, things like that. If we design a tax code like that, that would do so much better for our society. But our leaders are doing the opposite, and that's having a real huge effect on the racial equity in our tax code.
We've talked about it somewhat in the previous episodes as well. The narrative and messaging that goes with this as well. All of the ideas and beliefs that we hold around taxes and tax policy comes from years and years of building up, these narratives that really target specifically people of color. We have things like, the welfare queen and users and moochers and people who just want a handout. And it's always like really ironic to me that is the picture that comes to many people's minds when you consider all of these tax bills that have passed. We didn't even dig deep into the Bush era tax cuts that also benefited the wealthiest Americans. Um, that those are all handouts, right? What bigger handout than
Mm-hmm.
tax breaks
Right.
for the rich? Um, those are all handouts. Those, if anyone is draining the system, in my opinion, it's the people at the top of the top, the wealthiest of the wealthiest, who are actually costing us. We can put dollar
Mhm.
figures into what it actually costs us to hand them these tax breaks. We have those numbers, right? As Brakeyshia was just sharing some of those. So it's always ironic to me, and it's so much of what CFI and ITEP and so many of our sister organizations across the country do is focus on this mind shift and this belief shift that, as we've been saying, like, something better is possible, but that will require us to see people as people and not as people who drain a system, because who we are blaming for that, aren't the right folks.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So that happened in 2017. That is obviously still having an impact on us. And then jump ahead to today. Trump is serving his second term, and we see another kind of signature, not just tax package, but budget package, called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. At CFI, we call it HR 1, House Resolution 1. So this was an all-encompassing budget bill that was passed over the summer. I know all three of us were doing a lot of advocacy around this bill. So first, would you both just tell us a little bit about the work that you were doing to try to, advocate against this and make sure people did understand the harm that was going to come of it, and B, to try to minimize that harm as much as possible?
Yeah, over the summer. So really the conversation around HR 1 kind of started in February
Mm-hmm.
when there was a budget kind of reconciliation process going on in Congress, and reconciliation is just a process in the Senate that tries to make it easier to pass budget bills because it lowers the voting threshold basically to 51 to pass a budget bill, just to make it super simple to people because it is a confusing process. But it kind of started in February and then moved on to May, and then it got passed in July. And so throughout that time, we were meeting with partners. I was writing op-eds and blogs, working behind the scenes. But it was really the goal for me was to really connect the dots between what this meant for racial equity, because I felt like that was what was missing from the conversation. There was a really robust conversation about, okay, what does this mean for society? What does this mean for Trump's legacy? What is this going to mean for the national debt? What is this going to mean for our economy moving forward? What is this going to mean for SNAP and Medicaid? But I think the question that was missing again was like, what is this going to mean for racial equity? What is this actually going to mean for Black and brown households? What is this going to mean for our tax code moving forward when it comes to helping everyone in society? And so I made sure to reach out to groups that focus on helping people of color and communities of color. I work with them. I made sure to kind of help them get their talking points together. We crunched some numbers. I provided them with some of the numbers we had. I worked behind the scenes with making sure that some of those numbers got to legislative offices, things like that. Because again, it was just like a gap in the conversation that needed to be filled because I think it would help inform legislators with better information to kind of switch the conversation and switch the dialogue around what really was going to happen and what the real consequences were for this budget bill or this HR1 actual tax cut package and spending package. But, unfortunately, we didn't see, we saw that the bill passed and was signed. But I think right now we just have to hold him accountable, right? Like he's saying all these great things are going to happen, but are they really going to happen? And we know the answer is not, but now we have to hold him accountable. We have to put his feet to the fire. And so I think it's just making sure that we continue to keep our voices heard and kind of like what Esther was talking about, shift that narrative, that collective kind of that narrative that's going on, shift that national conversation. That way, when the midterms happen, when the next presidential election happens, we can have some people in office who can really implement policies that help people in communities of color, help low-income families, ensure that they can thrive in society and make really good economic choices and have that robust social safety net and things like that.
At the state level, we have been reeling since July, since February, really, and since the bill passed in July at the federal level with the impacts that it's having in Colorado. And I know that's true for many of our partners. For Colorado, like we are coupled or tied to the federal budget. And so anytime tax policy changes are made at the federal level, they just flow into Colorado without Coloradans in our Colorado legislature having any say into it. And so Colorado was one of the first states to call a special session to address the fact that those changes had an immediate effect on our budget at the state level. And so we relied on, the resources and the numbers, the number crunching that ITEP and folks did in order to make the case in Colorado that actually if the federal government was going to focus and prioritize on giving tax breaks to the wealthiest few and corporations, then at the state level we had to shield against that. And so we had to jump into action during the legislative session to decouple or unlink us from a lot of those tax changes and tax provisions that gave the biggest, not shocker, the theme of the story here, is that the biggest tax breaks are going to the wealthiest and to businesses and corporations. And so that wasn't any different with HR1. And we saw that the biggest cost drivers were those business tax breaks in HR1. And so it's come, it's hit Colorado really hard. We are going into our legislative session this year this week, and we know that we are in a really devastating situation. We are trying to fill this huge budget hole of over $800 million. When we know that for our state, we're already ranked dead last for starting teacher pay. We have most school districts on 4-day work weeks. We are, as we've been talking about, all the things that help really create healthy and thriving communities. We are not meeting the mark. And so all of these impacts at the federal level are really felt in Colorado and across the nation for many states that I know are having to make all these terrible decisions about where can they address these issues and save money through their budgets. And that unfortunately means making a lot of tax cuts to the very programs and services that are the essential safety nets for our communities.
And Colorado is not alone. I mean, other states are facing these rough decisions too. And it also is being compounded because there's less federal money coming into states. The, economy is different now. And then states had, years of tax cuts. So now they're having revenue shortfalls. So, the predicament that states are in right now is really, really tough. And HR1 didn't make it much easier. So you have to, make sure our legislators think about those critical services that we need and make sure that they continue to try to invest instead of trying to make more cuts. I mean, I know in Missouri they did a large capital gains tax cut last year, got rid of their capital gains, and now they're trying to get rid of the personal income tax, which is going to be a huge budget hole for them. And so you have to think about all these decisions that policymakers are making, but they have to be thinking about how are we going to fund all these critical services that we need. So we need to make our voices amplified and make sure they understand the critical needs that we need to survive and thrive in these economies.
I think one of the things that I would point out about all of these tax packages is we associate them with, Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump, but they're passed by representatives. They're passed by our Congress people, our senators, and
Yep.
our House representatives. And so one of the things that I was really focusing on over the summer as a campaigns and outreach member of the team was just making it hard for these representatives to vote yes on this. We kind of knew that the party is really shored up. We knew they really weren't going to allow any defections, especially with HR 1. And so the goal was to just make it a difficult vote for every single representative and senator who was going to vote yes on HR 1. We wanted it to be something that they were going to have to go back to their districts and face. And I think that we accomplished that both in Colorado and across the country. But if you remember over the summer, the backlash that representatives were facing in their districts, because people do understand what's happening here. And so I think it's just our jobs to continue banging that drum and making sure that everybody has the information available to them to be able to advocate for what is actually right for their communities.
It was one of the most unpopular bills past, in history. And there's polls to prove that. And for years, it's been showing that people want the government to tax the rich. It's been polls for decades showing that. And so the public already knows that these tax cuts are they're not palatable and they're unpopular. And so pushing and forcing these legislators to really understand that is really important. So I'm excited to hear that you guys are really pushing legislators and keeping their feet to the fire. I think that's really important. And it's something that other states and other people and other organizations need to be thinking critically about. And that's something we also were trying to push and hold their feet to the fire and keep them abreast of issues like that and reminding them of things like that about how unpopular these ideas are.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I think even if it feels like it didn't make a difference in the moment. So all of Colorado's Republican representatives did vote for HR 1, but just last week, with another big policy at the federal level, our representative Jeff Hurd, who is a Republican, did vote to extend enhanced premium tax credits, which are a really big issue when it comes to healthcare. And so I think that his vote to extend that, it was a break with his party, and I think that can be attributed directly to the pressure that he was feeling over the summer and beyond that. So even when like the vote doesn't necessarily go your way, it's still important to make sure that they understand what their constituents are actually sending them to the Capitol to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
With HR 1, because of policies that have been passed in the past that are similar, we know really what the long-term outcomes are going to be. It's going to further consolidate wealth at the top and make wealth building opportunities for people at the bottom just more out of reach. But what else? Do you have anything to just kind of wrap up? What do you expect will be the long-term ramifications of these policies?
I think it'll be harder for the economy to grow. I think we'll see the economy suffer and that really hurts people at the bottom more so than people at the top. I think we'll see the racial wealth gap expand, which hurts people of color more so. I think the racial wealth gap was actually converging, but now it'll probably expand. I think we'll see a lot more, the poverty rate might go up. I think we'll see a lot more people who are hungry and a lot more children without, with parents who don't have enough money to feed them or clothe them, things like that. I think we're going to see a lot of, a lot more sad economic stories in society, and it's really unfortunate. But I think again, if we can work with our legislators and continue fighting back, if we go out and vote in midterms in the presidential election and other elections as well, our local elections that happen, I think we can really make a difference. But I think HR one was a really, really bad bill that's gonna mess up society for a while. But I think we can really change things if we really try to fight back and change the narrative for the long term. We have to think about a long game moving forward and
Mhm.
switch the narrative, and that way we can pass more bills that really attack these issues and can really provide racial justice and get at racial inequity in the tax code.
Yeah, I agree with everything Brakeyshia said, and to bring it, close to home in Colorado, um, we are going to be dealing with the impacts of this for years to come, unfortunately. I mean, we're in 2026 and we're talking about, to this day, the huge and harmful impacts on the racial wealth gap that decisions in the 1980s have made, and from Reaganomics and trickle down economics, and how we're still trying to fight against that today. Bush era tax cuts, Trump's first term, and now his second term, and all the bills passed during those times. I want to make clear, like, we are in dire situations. We are actively allowing, and I don't say we, like they, these decisions that were made are actively allowing people to go hungry, and people will lose access to healthcare if they haven't already. People are losing their access to it. Just last week, that there was a federal decision to freeze TANF funds and CCAP funds for a select number of states. Colorado was blue states, and Colorado was one of them. And so we are, like, actively harming people. I don't think this is dire, and I want to paint that picture because it's going to take an everyone movement to push back against this, to fight against the impacts of the full effect of these tax policies on our communities in Colorado. Again, as we've been talking throughout this podcast, we have the added layer of the barrier of Tabor in Colorado. Like, we are actively experiencing warfare on our communities, and that's especially true for Black and Brown folks, communities of color who have historically been impacted by these very decisions. And so I want to name how dire it is, because I also want to name that. And I know, and with the example you just shared, Talia, of like what difference and what pushback we can have when we come together, when we hold our elected officials accountable for the decisions that they're making, that they can't just come back to Colorado and for it to be okay that they go back into their communities and not witness what their decisions and the impacts that they have on Coloradans. And so we have a long path forward. And we need everyone, especially in Colorado, to engage in this tax policy fight, because if anywhere, Colorado is the place to engage in tax policy decisions. Voters are the final decision makers on most tax policy decisions in this state. And so we need everyone. It's an everyone issue. And as Brakeyshia was saying, the historically the impacts and the barriers that Black and Brown communities have faced have been huge. But when you focus on policies that uplift Black women and Latina women, Indigenous women and Asian women, it helps white women, and it helps white men. And so when we truly lift from the bottom up, it is a benefit to everyone. It is a benefit to our communities, our society, and our state economy and budget. And so right now is not the time to shy away from tax policy. It's a time where we need everyone to really engage and realize that it's an us issue.
Exactly.
With that, I really appreciate the note that you both ended on. It feels very unifying and helpful to me, which, as I said, is something that I always want to hold on to. So I really appreciate you joining us, Brakeyshia, and thank you all for
Thank you for
listening.
having me.
Yes, of course. And next episode will be our final episode. We are going to talk about Tabor and tie it to all of these themes that we have already been talking about and breaking down.
Thanks so much.
Yep.
Thanks again, Brakeyshia. Thank you to
Mhm.
ITEP.
Thank you. Thank you, CFI.